Look, this is the fourth public forum that we've had, and it's great to see that everyone from the community being engaged in this enterprise. And dementia is really not just our problem; it's everyone's problem. Maybe not a problem, but certainly something that's headed our way. And those of us who are getting to that age are certainly thinking about it. And I think everyone in this room will know somebody who's either suffering from dementia or is starting in the early stages, and something which doesn't have a cure really still. And of course, that's what we're about here, trying to understand what's going on and trying to find a cure and trying to find better ways to support people with dementia. All those things is something that we're involved in. And so welcome to today's speakers, in particular Janice Besh, who's Director of the NHMRC National Institute for Dementia Research, Sue Peters-Hawke, who's the National Ambassador for Dementia Australia and co-chair of Federal Dementia Forum, Nancy Pannar. I can't see Nancy actually, up over there. Welcome, Nancy. Who's in the School of Psychology here at University of Queensland. Emma Niels, who's on our advisory board and is a geriatrician and physician. And Anthony White, who's principal researcher at QIMR Berghofer. Of course, members of our advisory boards and people who've donated to QBI and the community who are our supporters and people who are really interested here in dementia research. So look, there's a growing interest in dementia from many, many different places, as I mentioned. It's one thing to do the research and think about the biology, which is of course something that QBI is intimately interested in and something that we spend a lot of our time doing. But thinking about care and thinking about how to manage people, manage is a terrible word, but how to help people live with the disease and the families live with the disease. It's really not just a personal problem. It's something that affects everybody in the community, and having some sort of treatments for it, looking into the future, is something that's absolutely necessary. And of course, Jürgen's work here at QBI within CJ Cadre is now providing some ideas about ways to move forward in this area. So let me introduce Jürgen Goetz, who will talk about a bit more about today's forum. Jürgen, who's the director of the Clem Jones Center for Aging Dementia. Welcome.
Yeah, hello everyone. So I think you're all aware that dementia is the leading cause of disability of the elderly. And when we look at the worldwide figures, I think they are around 47 million. So it's a huge number. And here in Australia, we have approximately 420,000 cases of dementia. And this number is expected to grow to almost 1.2 million by 2050. So that's a staggering number. And Pankaj has mentioned Alzheimer's disease as one form of dementia. So Alzheimer's disease accounts maybe for 60 to 80% of all dementias, but there are many, many rarer dementias. And I think what's really the problem, that for none of these dementias there's a cure available, not for Alzheimer's disease, not for frontotemporal dementia. And this is despite the fact that Alzheimer's disease has kind of has been defined more than 100 years ago. So a century ago by Alois Alzheimer in 1907. And 100 years down the track, we know what the key players are of dementia from a biological point of view. But still today, we have no cure. We know there's a symptomatic treatment. Acetylcholinesterase inhibitors are being used, or memantine, an NMDA receptor antagonist. Now, luckily, here in Australia, the NNIDR has been established, the NHMRC, National Institute for Dementia Research. It's even an acronym as long as CJ Cadre. Hard to pronounce. And NNIDR has been established to coordinate and translate the strategic expansion of dementia research in Australia. And it all goes back to an initiative by the government, boosting dementia research with 200 million Australian dollars. And NNIDR is an initiative of the National Health and Medical Research Centre, but it's hosted and administered what was formerly known as Alzheimer's Australia. And I think this year, they rebranded themselves, so it's now called Dementia Australia, obviously reflecting the fact that Alzheimer's is just one of the dementias, although it's the most important form of dementia. So NNIDR has been established 5 years ago, and CJEC had always had a close relationship with NNIDR. And I would say that we always had a good relationship, but I think the relationship has been intensified since Janice Besh has taken over the directorship. And I should say that she does a terrific job. I mean, she's dealing with all the different stakeholders, let's put it that way. And I think we're all different. We have our own interests and our own agendas. But she's doing a really great job just to get us into the same room and to discuss things through. And at the moment, we're also looking at the roadmap, basically giving basic science a more prominent role, which I think is a great thing to do. So prior to taking up the role as NNIDR director, Janice held several senior strategy and management positions at a total of 3 Australian universities, also within the non-profit sector and in government. So please welcome Janice Besh to give the opening address for today's forum.
So thank you, Jürgen, for your kind words. And it's a real pleasure to be here and an honour as well. It's the first time I've had the opportunity to do the opening address at a forum like this. So bear with me, having just arrived on an international flight yesterday morning. I'll be reading more than I'll be ad-libbing this morning, and perhaps not completely on my game. But I'd also like to acknowledge the Turrbal people and the Jagera Nation as the traditional custodians of this country we're meeting on today, to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've joined us for our meeting today. Distinguished guests, everyone who's come to join us today, friends of the Dementia Research Enterprise, I'm really looking forward to telling you a little bit more about the Institute. As Jürgen has said, we were established 5 years ago. Now 4 years into the Institute's life, we're looking to the future and starting to define what needs to happen next. I'll spend a lot of my presentation talking about how we got to where we are today, what we've been able to achieve, but also try to give you a sense of what the thinking is now for the future. But of course, now let's see if I can get this working. There, perfect. You may have seen this infographic that has been created a couple of years ago by the World Dementia Council. The numbers that you're seeing there are 2015 numbers. And you'll see in that top left-hand corner this statistic, this very disturbing statistic, that 1 person every 3 seconds is being diagnosed with potential dementia, mild cognitive impairment, leading to any one of a number of forms of dementia. That will be the theme for Alzheimer's Dementia International's September Dementia Awareness, Alzheimer's Awareness Month this year. And it certainly does help to galvanise our thinking around what the challenges might be. Jürgen has mentioned the statistics for Australia. They're not featured on this chart, and when you look at the alarming numbers appearing in countries all around the world and what they're projected to be, we may think our problem is less, but we are a small country. What I do like to point out here, though, is the rising incidence and prevalence of dementia in our developing countries, in the lower to middle income countries, which are a part of our region. We've got enormous potential to make a contribution there, with countries such as China, Japan, India and Singapore all having advanced or rapidly maturing research and innovation systems, and I know quite a large number of collaborations are happening out of University of Queensland with those countries. But we can also, and this is what the World Health Organization urges us to think about, we can also make sure that our research effort and the work that we do to improve the lives of people with dementia makes a difference for the low to middle income countries in our region. It's part of our mandate and it's part of where we need to be. The World Health Organization has a global action plan for dementia in place now. That was a major achievement. It took many years to develop and a lot of countries around the world convincing the World Health Organization that this was something that could be tackled in a strategic way. You'll see there the 7 priorities that they have for the Global Action Plan. I won't read them through unless you want me to, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that our local strategy very much matches into this global strategy. One of the roles of the National Institute is to report to the World Health Organization on how we are meeting these objectives. So if you're concerned about dementia and you're concerned about the difference that research can make and you're concerned about the future, then be comforted by the fact that there are many people around the world looking also for a solution and that we are well networked into that effort. So in terms of Australia's response, 5 years ago, after intensive activity by people who had a very important stake in a positive outcome for dementia, we did have that $200 million allocated at that time by the Turnbull government, the Abbott government. Actually, it was Abbott was health minister at the time. And that has meant that we've got more funding coming through to dementia research now. Australia went about it a little differently from other countries. We actually joined up with Dementia Australia, then Alzheimer's Australia, to deliver the program of research. In most other countries, it's a more informal relationship, with Alzheimer's Australia, now Dementia Australia, being the delivery mechanism for the Boosting Dementia Research Initiative. I think it can be safely argued that we have a very strong link into community and to what the community wants and needs and would like to see happen. We also, I'm employed by Dementia Australia, but based within the National Health and Medical Research Council. And that means whenever we invest funding, we're always investing it through the gold standard peer review system that exists within the National Health and Medical Research Council. And it means that we know that we're funding the very best research and researchers out there to solve particular problems. The top-down approach that we have going here in Australia with this $200 million initiative is part of an international trend in policy to actually top-down start to marshal the research effort to solve particular health challenges. This is why people thought it was necessary to actually put that investment in. You'll see Ita Buttrose, who was one of the primary advocates for new funding, and she was Australian of the Year at the time, was looking at these numbers, which had remained steady state for a number of years. And you can see that dementia was well and truly funded at a much lower rate than other forms of chronic disease. And yet when you see the number of people impacted by dementia, that just didn't seem to right to her or to many others. The amount of money that comes in every year, the $200 million, effectively doubles the amount of funding that's going to dementia research. But I think we can all recognise that researchers do the most amazing job in Australia, contributing at the very highest level internationally, still on a lesser platform than other disease areas might have. The funding was distributed as above, and I'm quite happy and proud to say that we've given $9 million to the Clem Jones Centre for Ageing Dementia Research as one of the very first acts under the initiative. And then the funding has gone through our funding schemes at the NHMRC for large-scale research projects, team grants, a very large investment in fellowships. We have now 110 new research fellows in the innovation system as a result of this funding. They're both at the early career level and the leadership level now. And I'll talk in a little while about retaining that capacity because it's just so important to keep those people engaged. And it was good news for dementia research. So the Boosting Dementia Research Initiative lifted success rates under the NHMR schemes, almost doubling them at the time. More projects were being funded and much more work is underway than ever before. And I think we can all take heart from that. The funding was always governed by a strategic roadmap for dementia research and translation. And as Jürgen has said, that is now under review. We've had some very interesting discussions, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can see that the strategy is everything from prevention to cure and care. And it was actually put together with a lot of consumer involvement and input. There was actually a summit in 2016, and the outcomes that are identified in the strategic roadmap are very, very high level. One of the things we want to address this next time round is to have them a lot more tangible in terms of holding us to account for delivering them. But you can see that the idea of having things that make a real difference for people living with dementia and their carers are right at the heart of what we were looking to achieve. The other thing about it is that it is meant to tie through so that the people doing basic science, they're actually informing cure and care, cure and care, not just discovery of research. And I think that does happen in a very real way. Underlying principles, the World Health Organization also has underlying principles, and ours align very well with the World Health Organization thinking. We're looking to create powerful partnerships. One of the things that I would really like to see happen is much more engagement of a substantive nature with our foundations, so that we can have more foundations funding more research in partnership with universities and with researchers. We are always looking for translation of the new evidence that we're generating into the health system, and it's a very difficult thing to achieve, and we will be looking at that very strongly in future. And we're looking to leave a lasting legacy of change. The one thing I'd like to mention here, without boring you too much about policy and the way it works, just have to make sure I'm in the right space, is that I'm used to a touch screen. That's not giving me the benefit of it. I just wanted to mention that you may have heard of the Medical Research Future Fund. I know certainly the researchers in the room will have, and it's a huge investment. It's $1 billion endowment that is now starting to pump a lot of funding into the system. It came in to play in the funding system after the Institute was announced and after the $200 million initiative. But the way in which it's thought through is very similar to the way that the Institute was established as well. In fact, sometimes I think the same consultants might have written the two strategies. But the one thing that they do in the Medical Research Future Fund at the moment is they tend not to fund chronic diseases specifically. They do a little bit, but only to a minor degree. But the principles, the underlying principles on which they distribute funding are the same as ours, and I think that augurs well for the future. The progress today, even though we've got most of the money now in play, it's not spent yet, in the sense that we've had new projects coming on stream every year, and the projects that are being funded will play out till about 2023, the most recent of which will finish in 2023. Our challenge now, that red line indicates the actual end of the initiative, but our challenge now as we rewrite the roadmap is to look at how we push those lines out into the distance a lot more stably and a lot more securely. So what have we achieved with that funding? It's very difficult. The Minister asks us all the time, what difference have you made? You know, where are the outcomes? Where are the discoveries? And with that funding, coming into play and still, research takes a long time, it's sometimes difficult to come up with those stories. But using publishing metrics as a proxy, we can actually see an early boosting effect. And we had Thomas Barlow, who has done some work for the University of Queensland as well, look at the publication patterns since the initiative was introduced. And as you can see from that quote above, we are seeing a significant increase in the amount of research underway, the amount being published, and the amount being published in high-income journals. It's growing especially strongly at that leading edge internationally. That's what we want to see, and that's what a peer review system can deliver. Some people like to say, well, just give us the money and we'll do the best with it, but the peer review system really does make sure that we're driving that international excellence. And our connectivity, the connectivity of our research is growing much faster than the underlying global trend as well. The new funding is mainly going to the places where you would expect it to go, and that's good as far as it goes, and that's what we want to see. We want to see those people with great runs on the board being supported for their work. But interestingly, what Thomas found is that there's a boosting effect even beyond those core centres of research. So University of Queensland, of course, is a core centre of research, but we're also seeing many other universities starting to make dementia a priority, and that's a lovely, if you like, side outcome from the initiative, people focusing on it and directing their research towards it. And that's nice, that's even beyond where we fund. So we're now 4 years in, and with most of the funding mobilised, we are trying very hard as an institute. This is where the institute steps in to encourage collaboration and coordination. While I was in the US, I was able to talk to the NIH about getting our researchers working more effectively and more easily with their innovation system, or in a better supported way, for example. The one thing I would say as we go through this, we're really being watched closely to make sure that we do this well, that we actually make a difference for people with dementia and the people who live with that, with the outcomes. It's really important that we leverage Dementia Australia's capacity in the system as well. We reach out to 30,000 people who are connected into the Dementia Australia's consumer networks. We reach into 30,000 researchers through NHMRC. So it's a very powerful bridge that we're able to provide as we move into the future. If we don't make it work though, we will be in a much weaker position in future. I shouldn't say it so negatively, but I am concerned about it. Beyond the first years, we've got new funding schemes coming through NHMRC, which support new ideas, new collaborations, very much better opportunities for health services, so implementation research, and certainly geared to helping new and mid-career researchers find future careers and more stable careers in the sector. At NNIDR, we're really well positioned to provide strategic advice on future trends. We can have conversations that don't happen elsewhere in government, with foundations, with other governments, and with researchers. We have an expert advisory panel. Jürgen is one of our contributors to that panel, and it brings together everyone across prevention, care and cure, well, not everybody, of course, but very senior leaders in the field across prevention, cure and care to give us advice. And we have a very powerful management and monitoring role, which is a little bit unusual. NHMRC tends to front end its interest in the investment and look to outcomes in publications much further down the track. And the Institute is actually actively monitoring things as we go along. Our emerging programs that we're funding, you may have seen an announcement of a national dementia network in ADNET, which is targeting the opportunity for 4,000 people across Australia to have the disease course measured and monitored along the way. It's about positioning our innovation system for much speedier involvement in international clinical trials. It's about measuring the quality of care in the health system as well. And that was an $18 million investment that's only just been announced. And that emerging infrastructure will really support the enterprise. We'll also be doing a lot of work in improving our dementia data and statistics and making use of big data. One of the intriguing things that, and challenging things that is emerging now is the use of private sector data. And being positioned in Canberra, we can come across some of those developments in government where they're trying to tap into private sector data in a way that allows researchers to learn more about trends in human health. All of these things are starting to play, but new funding, which I know a lot of people are very concerned, particularly myself. It was one of my KPIs when I was employed. New funding will depend on a well-articulated case for action, and that's what we're about to do right now. So making the case in Australia, over the last few months, we made a call for submissions, and thank you to all of those people who did respond or became involved in our consumer focus groups of people with dementia and carers of people with dementia. We commissioned a policy review by Moira Kay Consulting, and she identified progress, the current issues that are being faced in the various priority areas for the roadmap. She conducted one-on-one interviews with research leaders, and she identified a number of research challenges, and we took that to a forum that was facilitated by Norman Swan in Melbourne recently, where we basically mushed all the ideas together and came up with some very clear areas of focus. That work is still in progress, but I'm very pleased that we've been able to do it. We've also, in parallel, looked at the challenge of dementia for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And one of our early career fellows, Kate Smith, has stepped up to the plate, and she's leading a roundtable process and national consultation. And that will sit within our larger roadmap. That's been more just stated on a principles basis in the past, and that will come forward as a real priority. And the same with those people from communities of diverse language backgrounds as well. We're doing some work to identify their needs and challenges, which become particularly acute once you get into the care system. The revised roadmap we intend to have ready for November. It will go through to our expert advisory panel and board soon, and there may be some tweaking. But what would it look like? We're looking at taking out the 5 priorities, which really covered the life course of the disease, and producing from those 3 broad areas of action. But that doesn't mean that other areas of the original roadmap are not important. For example, I was one of a number of people who considered that a focus on living with dementia should be cross-cutting, and it should involve a rights-based approach to every engagement with research and the health system across the disease course. So it was kind of funny to have it just as one of priorities sitting beside these other priorities. It really needed to be thought about at every stage. Similarly, diagnosis has been identified as foundational to the endeavour, with a priority emerging for better, more available diagnostic tools and an urgency to earlier identification and treatment. A lot of the clinical trials, I'm told, and as a lay person, any researcher in the room can correct my advice. One of the challenges has been people have been involved in clinical trials a little too late in the disease. So a new focus of the roadmap will be around this early diagnosis. It is also responding to a major development in the field where the definition of Alzheimer's disease is shifting away from symptoms to the presence of amyloid beta in the brain. And that allows you to pick up people much earlier in the life course. It's a little controversial, but it means that the importance now for us here in Australia to work with others internationally around identifying new diagnostic tools and biomarkers for the disease becomes increasingly urgent. So we'll see these things start to emerge in the roadmap. We'll also see a much stronger, as I was saying before, effort to come up with indicators that keep us really on the game and delivering. We will be trying to work with our stakeholders in a much more concrete way, in actual partnerships. One of them is, for example, with Dementia Training Australia, where we'll join with them on knowledge translation activities, helping to define how we know when things are ready for translation into the health system and how we know that health translation has actually happened. So lots of exciting things ahead in terms of the revised roadmap, and I look forward to bringing you news of that very soon. I do encourage anyone to feed in their ideas to us. I've left some of my cards on the table. If there are things that you would like to feed into the process, it's still not too late, but it's getting very close to too late. In my final closing comments, I'd just like to point out that we now have a report on early outcomes from the initiative on our website. We have a forum happening in 2019, one purpose of which will be to honour all the people who have provided the opportunity to concentrate on dementia research in this way. We can be contacted at any time, and we'll always get back to you. I now have staff, which is fabulous. And so I can say that with more confidence than I used to be able to. But yeah, thank you for your time today. I ask for your continuing support to an engagement in the research effort and beyond, and I encourage you to keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. It's great to hear some of the update that work that's been done by the National Dementia Research Institute. We actually got time for a couple of questions from the audience. Anybody? Okay, we'll move on. I'm pretty sure that Janice will be available to talk to you during the morning tea time if you have any questions. So now I'd like to welcome Professor Nancy Pannar. So Nancy is a co-director of the University of Queensland Aging Mind Initiative, and she has an international reputation in the area of geriatric mental health, particularly with her research in the late life anxiety disorder. And among her many publications, Nancy co-developed the Geriatric Anxiety Inventory, a published self-report inventory that is widely used both in clinic as well as in research, that has been translated in over 24 languages. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Nancy Pannar to present the talk, Clinical Research and Clinical Care.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk today, and it's my pleasure to talk about clinical research and clinical care, which is such a lovely title because then you can make any kind of slides you want because it's such a broad topic. I'm a neuropsychologist and a clinical psychologist, and I've worked my entire life with older adults and particularly people with dementia. And oftentimes, whether I'm speaking to clinicians or I'm speaking to families or people with dementia, people ask me very specific questions. They say, I've heard engaging my mind is very good. Should I play chess or checkers? And I have people in the nursing home asking me, Mr. Jones has this issue. What is the one thing I can do for that person that will work for the rest of time? And I hear people chuckling in the audience. These are people who know that these sorts of answers don't exist. And sometimes people are sad about that. They say, well, we should have answers that are very definite, because people want definite answers. And also there's a lot of stuff in the media where, people one day it's good to eat chocolate and then the next day it's not. One day it's good to drink wine and the next day it's not. And so, people would like some certainty. I prefer to think of these sorts of issues about clinical care and clinical research the way I think of my consulting work in nursing homes, in a systemic way. I think we need to think sometimes a little bit more broadly. And this pertains to researchers as well, because often we design experiments where everything is controlled except one variable. But life is a little bit more complex than that, and I believe that dementia is a little bit more complex than that. And so what I'd like to cover today looks like a lot of things, but I'll be just touching on these things briefly that illustrate this idea in terms of clinical research and clinical care, taking a more holistic and perhaps systemic view of problems and potential solutions associated with dementia and how this can move the field forward. So I'll talk a little bit about some prevention strategies and then some specific topics about clinical care. But I won't talk about the geriatric anxiety inventory. That's too specific. So we have all seen, a similar slide to this one where we have, dementia prevention strategies. So, lifestyle factors are very important to think about, and it's very important to think about them because people can take an active role in changing aspects of their lifestyle where it's a little bit harder to change your genetic makeup, at least at the present time. So, you have physical and mental activity are good, social engagement, and all of these things decrease the risk of the development of dementia. And so we have, eat blueberries, see your physician, have hobbies such as bird watching. I'm a bird watcher. I could highly recommend this for dementia care. And, some people have tried to combine these sorts of strategies. So the Canadians have made blueberry wine. So that seems like it could be going in a good holistic direction. But what does the research say about this? Well, I really love this study, and I have a colleague here visiting from the University of Bergen, so I had to throw in some Nordic research. And so this is research from the Karolinska Institute and the National Institute for Health and Welfare in Finland. It's a very highly cited study that was done a few years ago called the Finger Study, and it was a study about how we might prevent cognitive decline. And of course, the ultimate aim of the study is to see whether these strategies will decrease risk of dementia. And what they did was they got a large variety of volunteers, a large number of volunteers of a variety of ages, and they were given the people in the active arm of the study were given comprehensive advice on diet, exercise, cardiovascular training, brain training exercises, managing vascular risk factors, which is very important in dementia. And they were doing all of these things at the same time. It was a holistic approach, and they compared this holistic approach to a control group that was sort of treatment as usual or life as usual, however you want to put it. And, so those people who did actually participate actively and change things in their lifestyle, and who did the memory training did significantly better on memory tests 2 years later. And there are a lot of studies like this in the literature that show if you do things even very much later in life, physical attributes and cognitive attributes can change. But I really like this study because it sort of threw everything at people. And it gets away from this idea that you only have to think about one thing. Because if you come from a family that has a high degree of cardiovascular risk, maybe the cardiovascular aspects are more important, and maybe for another person it could be the brain training. So I really like this study, and it's just an example of this kind of systemic thinking that I think should be more, we should have more of that. Now I'm going to turn to some specific clinical issues that are particularly vexing. Now, sleep is a particularly vexing issue because sleep efficiency over the lifespan declines. So people don't sleep, they don't have as deep a sleep, and they don't get as much of a sense of being rested when sleeping at later ends of the lifespan. There's a whole raft of reasons for that. But then it becomes particularly more problematic in dementia. But it isn't really just about the person with dementia and their sleep, because there's a dyad there, right? There's the caregiver who is often the spouse or partner of the person with dementia, and they're being negatively affected by this. Maybe their actual sleep is being affected by this. Maybe their mental health is being affected by this. They may be becoming more depressed. And so this is an interesting example of a sleep education program that was aimed at obviously reducing sleep disturbance in people with dementia, but it was through the caregiver. And the caregiver, again, was given a lot of information about how sleep could be improved in terms of sleep hygiene and exercise and light therapy and all sorts of things like that. So again, it's a multimodal approach. And lo and behold, the program had good outcomes for both the carer and the person with dementia in terms of their sleep and in terms of their mental health. So again, I like this approach. It's involving the two parties that are probably most invested in getting a good night's sleep, and you see the positive outcomes that flow from that. So again, it's a systemic approach, and sleep is very important to tackle in dementia because there's a lot of research that shows that if you can ameliorate sleep, you may be able to slow some of the declines associated with dementia. So I've done the other stream of my research that I've done in addition to the geriatric anxiety inventory is driving. And so I couldn't miss the opportunity to talk a little bit about driving as a caregiving issue in terms of dementia. And I, like many people in the room, would like to keep driving as long as I can. This is actually my little midlife crisis car that I really like to drive. So I would like to keep driving myself as long as possible. Often my students will say, "Oh, Nancy, you'll give up driving." And if I can't, well, maybe, I don't know. But I may not be able to for a variety of reasons. You know, I might hit a cassowary, or there may be other surprises ahead. And part of the surprises ahead as we age are physical and cognitive issues that prevent us from driving safely, because driving is a right, not a privilege, and it has huge public safety ramifications. Driving is actually the longest standing bit of my research ever since I was a postdoctoral fellow. But it's a really vexing issue because what are the alternatives that you're going to, present to people? Well, certainly when I was visiting the Netherlands, I did give bicycling a try, almost got myself killed because they cycle very quickly there. And despite being a lifelong Trekkie, we still do not have transporters, and really, I don't know why, when we're doing all this great stuff. And when you are dealing with people with dementia or with families, it's really hard to just say, well, just take the bus, just take the ferry, you know, that may not be a good solution. And it's not a good solution, certainly, to promise people, to overpromise people to be their personal transport, because it leaves people with dementia feeling very betrayed when transport is taken away and then promises are not kept. So you really need to have a very good systemic approach when dealing with driving, because you have health professionals that are caught in this uncomfortable mix of having to make driving determinations, sometimes without very much training. The ability to get around and be independent is a big part of people's identity, and then to be a non-driver has real ramifications. Family feel quite a bit of pressure, sometimes an anger, and there may not be easy solutions to a driving situation. But it's very important to come to some sort of planful, systemic solution to this, because it has, as I mentioned, public safety ramifications, and it really has quite an impact on how the person is able to lead the rest of their life in terms of quality if driving is no longer an option. So at UQ, we've developed a driving cessation program. And this then takes away this idea that, well, we're going to take the keys away and then that's the end of the story. No, this is a model where if people have to give up driving for whatever reason, at whatever age, we take them through a program that teaches them about public transportation, that teaches them, or we work with them to really refine their mobility goals, and then design strategies that they can overcome and still meet their mobility goals. And in a randomized controlled trial, we found that people were indeed able to have good quality of life, meet their transportation goals, and feel a continued sense of independence. This was with healthy older adults, and we've recently expanded into having this program available for people with dementia. And what we have found, and this is an example of a paper that we did where we were asking people, you know, what are some of the issues that people face when dementia is a factor in driving cessation? And the first column is really, you know, what is the state of play? So, you know, people have this sense of, you know, waiting for the other shoe to drop, not sure where to go. And then there's some event that requires acute adjustment, maybe an accident, maybe something medical, and then a long period of adjustment with a lot of grief and perhaps recriminations. And what we'd like to do is change this roadmap and have more education, have a specific intervention that we run, which is a 6-week intervention with persons with dementia and their family, to again work through goals in a systemic way with the family. And we're also now starting to work with GPs and extend that system in which driving cessation is handled in the course of clinical practice with tools, with sensitivity, with handouts, and with knowledge, and all people are kind of on the same page as much as possible all throughout that clinical process. And to me, this is really a model of where we should be going. And there's lots of these initiatives. This is just part of a conversation that's happening globally. They have the same conversation going in the Netherlands because they do rely a lot on bicycles, and you don't need a license to have a bicycle, but you can still cause a lot of chaos on the road if you can't steer your bicycle. So this is a good example, again, of systemic research in the realm of care. Now, as a psychologist, I have to give a plug for psychological research as helping with care. And so perennially, the issue of caregiver stress comes up, and there's a lot of research talking about psychotherapeutic interventions, for example, CBT, or some of the variants of CBT, like acceptance and commitment therapy. I will say that these sorts of models work best if they're couched in a more systemic approach, where families and people with dementia can say, well, I need particular help with perhaps more basic issues, as well as help with kind of coping with stress and worries and planning and concerns. So while there is a lot of support for psychological approaches, particularly in alleviating depression in caregivers and an increasing amount of research on anxiety in caregivers, that these approaches really do work best when there's a systemic approach, when the GP and other people in the healthcare constellation around the person are also working on other strategies and responding to acute situations. The last bit of research is research that is being done by my PhD student. And I think it's important to acknowledge, as the first speaker did, the real importance of early career researchers getting excited about this area of dementia and trying to forge a career path in this area of research. So Nicole had spent a lot of time in aged care, and she really felt that she wanted to make a direct contribution into the aged care environment, but wanted to also involve other students, because she got a lot of questions when she was doing her research, like, I don't know, I've never interacted with a person with dementia, or I don't know anything about aged care. And so she developed this entire outreach program with our School of Psychology, and it's called the Good Neighbor Program. And it was developed to meet unmet needs of reduced social connectedness and increased loneliness of older adults living in residential aged care facilities. But really what she was trying to do is change the context and the tone of the environment. And to me, this is core. If you are dealing with a nursing home environment or residential aged care, it's a whole system. And the system, if it has many negative aspects, it can be very self-perpetuating and difficult to enact change. And she really wanted to change that by dropping students in. And of course, if you drop students in, then you get a lot of change and maybe some unexpected change. But we did try to make sure it was positive and expected change by having the students undergo sessions for 12 weeks for 2 hours to learn about that's how much time they spent with the people. And then they did several 1-hour lectures about aging and older adults and dementia. So they were kind of upskilled in working with people with dementia. And we also gave a session to staff on transitions and the importance of social contact, and also just the difficulties of transitioning into an aged care environment. And the results were really astonishing. We paired 60 students with 60 residents, and we did both qualitative and quantitative analyses. And so the qualitative results showed for the students, lots of insights about older persons, about models of care, about employment opportunities and ways that they could, in their career, whatever discipline they chose to major in, how they might work with older adults, which is great from my perspective, because we are in the midst of a crisis of not having enough people available to work who are trained to work in geriatric care. And for the staff showed huge improvements in terms of their sort of revelations about the insights they had about the patients in their care, about how the students developed these friendships, and suddenly people were outgoing and making friendships within the facility because people found that they shared interests and hobbies. And really that this lessened the burden of social responsibility for staff, but also, and it's difficult to capture, but also gave them hope and a lot of motivation, and it really changed the aspects of the environment. And so in a follow-up study to this, we're going to be looking at more hard markers of, attrition and staff burnout, and really expand the study into Nicole's postdoctoral research. And obviously we did some quantitative data, and that revealed increased positive social contact, decreased negative contact, and reduced ageism, which is a big problem in care. The final bit of research I'll just mention, because as in the intro, I am the co-lead of the BDHP aging theme, the Brisbane Diamantina Health Partners Initiative for Metro North and Metro South. And one of our big initiatives is the Dementia Friendly Hospital. And again, dementia friendliness was mentioned in the World Health Organization overarching goals for improving dementia care worldwide. And so we have a bold initiative to try to improve dementia friendliness in Metro North and Metro South and affiliated organizations here in Brisbane. And in other research that's been done overseas, this is a big problem because older adults with dementia have many more hospitalizations, longer stays, many more emergency room visits. And so, you know, the hospital really has to be upskilled in terms of its approach to people with dementia. And so dementia-friendly hospital initiatives include giving people education about a range of topics, including communication and liaising with family. And it's kind of, again, it's a systemic approach to when the person comes in to the hospital with dementia, it should be that they have a clear and smooth transition as much as possible, and the family as well, through, that's my alarm. Oh, and there's another alarm. Okay, I'm almost done. And so it should not be of concern. And, you know, a colleague of mine told the story that, you know, if there was a major crash on the freeway today on the Centenary Highway, all of the hospitals would have, you know, their big emergency plan for triage coming into the ER. But if an older adult comes in confused with delirium to the ER, often people struggle to deal with that person. And that's something that a dementia-friendly hospital initiative seeks to correct, because really dementia should be something that the hospital is quite comfortable and the staff are quite familiar with dealing with, whatever part of the hospital the person is in. So I will end on that note, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned the program with students working with people in residential aged care.
Yes.
Were these people demented, and do they have dementia of any degree? Because most people in nursing homes do. And if so, what were the improvements in the residents? You've talked about improvements in the students and the relationship, but were there any improvements in the residents?
Yes, so we chose because of issues with, this is a problem that I've written with about with ethics procedures, and due to the timeline of her thesis, we could only concentrate on the students and the people, the staff. But in her, and they were almost exclusively people with dementia, but in the next iteration, now that we have this pilot data, we will be directly measuring emotional and cognitive aspects, as well as just how they're responding to the program of the people with dementia.
Nancy, you mentioned the finger study. I think from readings that I've done, it was conducted between 2009 and 2011 in Finland, about 1,200 participants. Have they thought about doing a follow-up study?
Yes, they are in the midst of doing a follow-up study because it needs to be longitudinal research to see about that.
Thank you. Nancy, I was wondering if there is any evidence to date of a link between someone who has extremely restless sleep, where they have lots of multiple body movements, and dementia.
Certainly, restless sleep is a feature of Parkinson's disease, which is another subpopulation that I study, which has a range of negative consequences on both cognitive and emotional health, both for the person with the restless sleep and the person that, if they're sharing a bed with somebody, then that person gets no sleep as well. I can't think of a particular study linking that. It wouldn't surprise me though, because sleep is such a core issue in terms of consolidating memories, in terms of just emotional functioning, that it would be hard to think that a person, if they developed such a severe sleep disorder, if you wouldn't see cognitive issues. Whether or not that would lead to a direct risk of dementia, I don't have that to hand, but it's certainly not a good thing. Okay. One more question. We have to give this side a chance because this side has had its chance.
I've recently joined a men's shed and U3A, and I'm interested to know what sort of research has been conducted into either or both of those organisations in terms of how they actually help people, and would that be a better allocation of funding in terms of an early intervention?
What was the first organization? It was U3A and?
Men's shed. Men's.
Oh, men's shed. Yeah. I'm a big fan of the men's shed. I think that, I would take a systemic approach. I think that, certainly the men's shed, U3A, any kind of program that keeps people mentally connected and physically active, is going to have positive benefits. And I think that maybe those programs could rate for research funding. Research funding has to be spread in terms of the system across many things, but certainly the research is very strong that maintaining social connections, and particularly we have expertise at UQ that maintaining memberships of groups is very important, because you have then the added benefit of saying, well, I belong to this group, it's the strong social connection, and that is added benefits. There was also a Scandinavian study that showed that, for example, if you like to read, that's a good thing, right? Because it improves your cognition. But it's a better thing if you join a book club, right? Because then you have the social engagement as well as the cognitive engagement. So yes, I think that both of those things, and particularly the men's shed for the emotional support it often offers, and the intergenerational outreach with younger men, and the mentoring that sometimes goes on. No? Well, the men's shed that I'm familiar with up in Redcliffe does a little bit of that, but men's sheds do their own thing. So, but I do think that those groups are excellent examples of ways in which older adults can keep cognitively active and socially active in the community, and it definitely should be researched. I thank you very much for your questions.
So thank you, Nancy. Our next speaker is Sue Peter-Hawkes. She's a dementia advocate, a national ambassador for Dementia Australia, and a person who worked throughout the community to raise awareness of the need for significant reform in our thinking and practice regarding dementia. So today, Sue will be telling us about human rights-based approach to care and support. Please welcome Sue.
Okay, I don't need any slides. I'm an old-fashioned type that just talks, but have accessories at the moment. Pardon me if I break into a splutter here or there. But yes, I want to talk about the case for rights-based care and support. I think we have to break down language a lot as part of breaking down our attitudes and our assumptions. So I interchange the use of the word care. Don't like the use of the word caregivers, although I realise it's just culturally determined more in some places than in others. I think care partners is good. My preferred term is supporter, but then, yeah, horses for courses. For me, if I look at involvement in this situation now for, God, nearly 20 years, starting with my experience with my mum, it's been a long journey, and I've arrived at a point in this journey where I would declare this to be my vision. And that is that people with dementia are empowered, engaged, and supported to design and create their own lives and futures. This is their right as human beings. Their vision and preferences, large and small, are central to determining any care or support provided to enhance their lives as they choose to live them. You could argue wording or whatever, but that probably gives you the gist of where I'm coming from. Where that leaves, and some of you in this room today have dementia, some of you are care partners, supporters, whatever, or people with dementia. Some of you are researchers, you'll have different positions or stakeholder descriptions in this thing that I call dementia land. But I think what a vision like this does is it challenges us. Is that the sort of vision we're interested in working towards? And for those of us who are committed to this sort of vision and to the values embedded and implicit in it, are then actively engaged, if we take this on, in reconfiguring our relationships and practice from those given from the past by traditional narrative, from habit and so on, and from coming from places that historically do essentially dehumanise people with dementia, and has us know what's best for them. It has us work hard on transitioning from that to new forms of relating, contributing, serving and advocating that arise from a collaborative perspective, grounded in, I would say, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the disability rights movements, or in the principles of those, at least. And I hope to show how I think this is very practical and offers scope and templates for a lot of work to be done. But my journey alongside my mum and with many diverse others beyond has led my own learning process. From initial fear, ignorance, I'm very good at thinking if you ignore things, they'll go away. I mean, it's true. You ignore the mail and 6 months later, 80% of it's irrelevant. But sometimes it doesn't work like that, right? Starting to think, there's something going on here, and trying often clumsily, seeing that I had unwitting prejudice as I started in this journey, trying clumsily, sometimes well, sometimes in ways I look back on and cringe, to simply do my best, which at the end of the day is all any of us can do. But it's here I would say, and we can get so technical in this, but I just stop and say, thank heavens for love. Thank heavens for the heartfelt human connections, be they of family or work-based, care relationship, support relationship-based or whatever, that quality of human love and affection and care and respect. It's not the only key. But for me, in the midst of so much trauma at the time and confusion and fear, I was in one of those situations, where you learn all about something you never wanted to know about. It was one of those. I've had lots of those. You've probably all got your own. That was what opened the door, through my own fear and the fear of everybody else's, including my mum's and surrounding us. That's what opened the door to going, hold on a minute. That attitude, these choices, that's crap. It's wrong. It all rather demeans someone whom I love and respect, who's actually mostly doing really well and maybe just needs some support, instead of me and others thinking we know better and taking over. Kate Swaffer has talked very persuasively, I think, and with a lot of backup about this notion of prescribed disengagement, which even when it doesn't happen overtly, is covertly our attitude to people with dementia. That disengagement from being a normal person and doing normal person things is the way forward with the disease. And the corollary of that for carers, family members, etc., is we are prescribed takeover. You know, we're now the people responsible for their lives and who know best and who should be making decisions in their interests and so on. But anyhow, so I started to think, this doesn't seem right. And I'm not alone by any means in that. And I think what we're starting to see now, which I want to talk to you about because I think it creates a new context for everybody, researchers, providers, policymakers and everybody in the field, because I think we've been looking for new information, new perspectives, better ways of thinking and doing. It evolves, and I think some exciting stuff is starting to evolve now out of this simmering discontent with how things have been and the foundation of our responses to dementia and people with dementia. And what are some new foundations that will create better lived realities for everybody? Because, you know, you can't get win-lose in this situation. It's got to be a win-win, and the direction we're advocating for does that, I think. But let me just note and pay respect to my mum's determination to have her own voice. Gosh, she was bolshy. To refuse to be defined by disease. And I think this came in some ways from she'd spent her age until then finding her agency in life, having grown up as a young woman where it didn't matter how bright you were or that you'd been offered scholarships. You left school at 14 and became a secretary and supported the family until you married and had kids and lived a couple of blocks away. And that was what you did. And so and then this nice man she married went a bit off script too, and then along came feminism with all these new scripts where women, my mother's age, the women I call my mum and my aunties, are the women who lived the shift into new visions for who women could be. And those visions included full human rights and agency. And transitioning to that ain't easy. It's about internal changes, and it's also about changing the people around you and social structures and all sorts of things. And so Mum had that context for her life. And when this dementia came along, she just refused to be defined by the disease. Her determination to advocate for and demand agency, human rights, dignity and respect, those things, she remains the only well-known person to come out living openly with the disease and keep doing high-profile stuff and just thinking, oh, well, to hell with what people think. She said she felt lighter for coming out. And this is, a while back when stigma is even greater than now, although we still have a long way to go. But those things that Mum and many others over the years have asked for, mostly in isolation and often in the face of ridicule or dismissal, because they went counter to the prescribed sort of idea of dementia. These things are now part of a global groundswell led by people with dementia themselves, supporting each other and advocating superbly, in my view, for a fundamentally altered perspective to that given by inherited constructs, and for changes in policy, attitudes and practice that flow as a matter of logic from a transformed perspective. Because if you look at it really, against the disability rights slogan of nothing about us without us, the whole system is still mostly and always has pretty well been premised on about them without them. And I say this not to make people wrong. This is not a critique of people. This is a bit of a history lesson and a look at that we have systems that come out of medieval attitudes towards mental difference and institutional responses to that difference that didn't have rights or flexibility or individual choices or agency built into how they responded. So it's not that people are wrong, it's that we've got the wrong systems for the outcomes we now expect and want in our lives. It's just the nature of how it's been. But people with dementia or nervous they might have it or living with the searing impact of a diagnosis live within these narratives and constraints and attitudes given by history and by us perpetuating it. And some of them are muttering. My friend Dennis Frost from Coma comes to mind. He does it with music. We're not going to take it anymore. In his view, we've all been warned. Pardon me. Time doesn't permit me to deconstruct the flaws of our inherited narrative and its consequences, although I do rather like doing that sometimes. A lot of these things are invisible to us as water is to fish or air to birds. But let me just highlight what Stephen Sabat, for example, calls the malignant positioning of people with dementia. The language of loss, tragedy, incapacity, inevitable violence, and absence. The perpetuation of a perception of people with dementia as other, as not really here, as not fully or properly human. These things are all in current language today. You'll find them in case notes. And this dominant narrative is medieval in origin and strips people with dementia of full humanity, agency and value as human beings. It might not mean to, but it's what it does. And it does it as powerfully, for example, as historical perceptions of gender allowed women to be chattels. Look up that word, chattels, it's fabulous. Or historical notions of race allowed for slavery, or for the terra nullius doctrine, which said that Australia was unoccupied when the British landed here, and the gross acts of human indecency that have flowed from those sorts of perceptions. And I think we get gross acts of indecency around dementia at the moment. I just think mostly they're well hidden. So it's no wonder dementia remains one of the most widely feared and stigmatised diagnoses. And here I'm not trying to be Pollyanna, or I'm not denying the impact of any serious life-altering and life-limiting disease. The socially constructed meaning of dementia and responses to dementia are often told to me and observed by me to be the hardest aspects at times of the diagnosis to deal with. Living in the context of who somebody thinks you are with dementia can be more challenging sometimes. And your own ideas of who you are. I watch Mum fighting it internally as well. So it's no mystery that it's a big bogey. And in our sector where we're educated and we listen to each other all the time, we can forget, but you know, really out there, it's still very like that. I still get asked over and over again by somebody whose mother or grandmother or somebody's just been diagnosed, when will they turn violent? They just think it's normal. It's like, this is what we're dealing with. So it's no mystery, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for living well with dementia, which just as it's become a key approach to bringing a whole suite of tools to living with any serious disease, it's become a mantra, again, for people with dementia, such as those who've co-founded the Global Dementia Alliance International. It's about seeking to live well with dementia and to create conversations and perceptions that become the container for that. And the two pillars that this all rests on, if you like, for a momentary architectural sort of view, these pillars exist, and I think this is a very good thing and is going to help over time, because these pillars do exist firmly in global and public discourse, and are concepts which many citizens grasp and care about, and which are widely reflected in international law and laws of many nations at levels from national to local government. Some of the laws that have come out of conventions on right of people with disability have led to great stuff at local government level that a lot of people might not know about. And in fact, we break conventions we're signed up to every day of the week. We are big international law breakers, just in the area of elder and dementia care, let alone, we won't talk about refugees right now. And so, yeah, we know life isn't perfect, but we do have instruments and aspirations that are a framework beyond what we're saying that we're reaching to be part of. My own belief, and I think it's important to reflect on this a bit because I think it'll help if you come down this path with us to look at where your motivation and energy lies. My own belief is that rights do not exist like, this microphone or gravity or a tree, but are declarations of shared belief and values, and are only brought into being and available as lived experience out of processes whereby we declare shared values as and about human beings, ones that include but extend beyond our own self-interest, and that imply commitments around our individual and collective behaviours and towards the ongoing work of implementation so that these rights are brought into being by collective intent and enterprise, becoming available for all to share. Now, whether you share this view or not, that they're aspirational and they're a declaration, they're a common shared platform, a value system, or regard rights as inherently existing, or see them as God-given, doesn't really matter for my money, because the down and dirty reality is that it takes collaboration, imagination and ongoing work to sustain them and have them available to all. I think the most important thing about the Declaration of Human Rights was that it was a universal Declaration of Human Rights. You'd had rights stuff happening, you'd had it in ancient history, in some pockets of ancient history, but you then had it in the French Revolutions and the American War of Independence and Constitution, but they weren't universal. They were very glorious and people still go on about them, but they basically applied if you're a white male landowner. They were not universal human rights. So it was after two dreadful world wars and this sense of humanity in crisis and needing new pathways forward. And out of that very, very widely shared sense that people of very different belief systems came together and created universal human rights, because for the first time then, we had the recognition of the inherent value of each and every person, based on principles of dignity, equality and mutual respect, being treated fairly and treating others fairly, having the ability to make genuine choices and express agency in their own life. And these things more and more have come to be seen as the cornerstone of strong civil societies. And they're subject to different interpretations in different countries, and I have no problem with that. But it was and is revolutionary as it aspires to the full and complete entitlement to and enjoyment of these rights by all human beings as a function simply of being human, no subdivisions tolerated. Now, of course, everybody did keep making exceptions. Hillary Clinton had to stand up in Beijing and say women's rights are human rights, because 50% had been more or less excluded. And I think the disability rights movement is very instructive, because here was another group of people who had a movement going for 100 years or so and then came in under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and said, hey, that's us too. You've got all these discomforts and this, that and the other and all these things that make you think we're not normal and that therefore doesn't apply to us. But it's bullshit. We're human beings, and they've won this argument over the years and it's made its way into legislation. It has a few, I would say, three key characteristics of the disability rights movement, and disability is often spelt with a capital A in the disability to emphasise ability, and they emphasise social inclusion and participation, agency, and enablement and support for capacity and ability replaces deficit thinking actively. And often summed up by a sentence I came across where we are subjects in our own narratives rather than primarily objects in the narratives of others. And the United Nations Disability Declaration, the treaty of which we are signed up to and ignore mostly, makes 13 distinct proclamations, including the right to respect for human dignity, right to measures designed to enable self-reliance, right to participate in social, creative and recreational activities, and the right to protection against exploitation, discrimination and abuse. So that's the foundation of the intellectual framework that I think is becoming the new foundation or prism through which to see the directions to go and develop in dementia care. And they're challenging, make no belief, because the systems we have aren't predicated on those assumptions. They're well-meaning systems staffed by overwhelmingly good people with good intent. But you sort of can't drive a bus down the right road if it's taken off down here and hasn't, you know, the steering wheel won't go that way in the design, you know. So there's a lot up for happening. You know, for me, as a former care partner, an advocate and now a consultant living without dementia, it has been a matter of reflecting on personal and shared experience, taking a lot of advice and being mentored by many of the advocates with dementia, taking this compelling case on board and looking at and examining and keeping on thinking about how we collaboratively develop this both in principle and practice across our sector so that that vision I spoke about in the beginning becomes the lived reality available to people with dementia. And these challenges are being met so far in a variety of ways across the sector, from a sort of a patronising incredulity to, well, people with dementia couldn't do that, to, oh, it'll blow over, just another fad, to enthusiastic embrace. I like that last one best, that's where I sit. And I think what I'm looking at it as is an evolving approach to what we're now calling rights-based care and support. It's not an incremental revision of historically given mainstream constructs and assumptions about dementia, but a discontinuous paradigm resting on very different assumptions. And I think we need to get this. We need to see what we're up for if we want to go this way. So a lot of work needs to happen and will be happening and is happening in the next few years to shift the sector in this direction to some degree. And I think it's going to take quite a while, but I think to the extent that it is successfully established in certain places, everything else will look like compared to it. I think it will triumph. So, yeah, you've got to be an optimist, otherwise how do you get up in the morning, huh? So I can't say everything that it brings up, but I do want to note some core features or observations regarding human rights, rights-based care and support. That this movement, advocacy movement by...
Sorry to interrupt you, but I just wonder what the thoughts were going in this direction about the definition, you know, thinking of dementia as a medical condition.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you agree with that?
I think there's medical things going on in a proper diagnosis of dementia. As we know, there's over 100 different dementias, so it's way more complex than people think. But I think on top of a medical diagnosis, we often get medical constructs of care and treatment.
The reason I asked, a lot of those labelling comes from the idea of having a disease.
Medicalisation, yes, rather than being a person who has, yes, been diagnosed with a disease. And some of what I'm saying applied to HIV or to cancer, but they've battled their way out of it. And now dementia is in that battle. So yeah, this whole thing has been, some of the advocates, people with dementia, have concentrated very much on global advocacy, and it's having an impact on the front line in projects around the globe. I'm dying to hear about Chicago, and at the United Nations World Health Organization level. It has been developed and led by people with dementia themselves, referring to I'm thinking of Peter Mitter, people who are experts on human rights and who've gone from being an advisor to now being an advisor with dementia, still advising on human rights. And they're advocating for changes and evolving it themselves in terms of how they're viewed and what they might want as care or support and what they might not want. And borrowing from disability rights, this movement points out that the various dementias are, as we know, widely variant neurological and cognitive impairments. In the disability rights movement, it talks about impairment as a physical or medical fact and disability as a social construct that gets created around it. Now, there's quite a lot of argument going on around dementia. I don't want to go down that tunnel. I don't care if people with dementia identify as disabled or not. It's empowering for some and not for others. But I think in terms of looking at rights, it gives us a very useful, punchy paradigm to look. A disability rights approach applies in putting in tailored support, like wheelchair ramps or hearing loops or whatever. That's some of the stuff we've already got, right, for disability rights support. But it looks at putting in tailored support at different points in the journey to maximise capacity, participation and enjoyment. And it's going to depend on us getting much, much more effective with CDC than we are at the moment. That, to me, is part of the work that has to happen here. Human rights-based care and support embraces diversity as a reality of human existence. And so it's not some new one-size-fits-all academic theory that will fix everything, or it can't give you one model of how to do things, because it's saying that different people are going to want to do things different ways, and we need to build flexibility and capacity to bargain so that offsets don't ruin a person's life and all those sorts of things, but that diversity is the name of the game. A person with dementia is the expert in the life they want to lead. Now, this is actually a revolutionary proposal to some people. People with dementia are the central agents in choices and decisions about them and their lives within this approach. It means that we all need to be looking at new ways of making decisions and choices with people with dementia. And there's new work coming out, Janice, isn't there, on supported decision-making, which is one of the very key tools. And there's a training seminar coming up in it very shortly, I think. And I think that's work that will roll out. I think that will start to become seen as core dementia skills, because I think what dementia skills are and aren't is going to be a different set of skills within a rights-based care and support system than it's currently seen as. And so that we become skilled in supporting, where necessary, decision-making, rather than the current norm, which is to default to substituted decision-making by others on a person's behalf. Another feature that I think, I sort of implied earlier, but is very strong in this movement of rights-based care and support, is that it's about looking at living well with dementia for as long as possible. Now, I've talked to different people and different stories and observed many, and there's usually a real crap patch at the time of diagnosis. Having been through cancer myself, I can get that. But some people come through it with support, usually, out of their own process, to a place where, well, I'm damn well going to live well. Okay, I've been given news that changes my life, but how am I going to deal well with that? And how am I going to live well for as long as I can? And this is part of why I just love this movement, is because it's essentially life-affirming rather than wash, dress, bathe the shells and prop them up in front of Andrew Year on television sort of approach. It suggests, this new approach, and I would say it quite explicitly, but it suggests that we have actually reached the outer limits. We're running out of true innovation driven by when innovation is being driven inside old models of benevolent intent of doing good things for people with dementia. and that the future, and I think this includes research and defining research goals, is collaborative. It asks that the expertise and goodwill of people without dementia be contributed, just about finished, but I lost my spot. In the context of valuing human rights of people with dementia, not of superseding them or knowing better or what's good for them. It doesn't devalue knowledge or expertise that is life-enhancing, but rejects false predications that often underlies implementation. It throws in your face the, for some people, very difficult proposition that people experience their own lives, at least, until they die. At least. I'm not going to make any commentary after that. I don't feel qualified. But I experienced this with my mum to be absolutely true. And as she died, you know, I felt her leave, and I've talked to other people since, and I thought it was all a bit weirdo, but I've discovered it's not an uncommon experience. People can always communicate and are always communicating. Are you going to learn the lingo or not? Impaired does not equal regressed or childlike. The next time I hear a director of nursing giving a family a lecture about, well, just understand it by regression to childhood and you'll have the idea. I think I am actually going to punch or slap somebody if I hear it again. Because these new narratives reject infantilisation and minimisation of humanity and individuality. Another core feature, people with dementia, and John's been very strong on this one, haven't you, John? People with dementia can learn and develop. Some forms of learning might be slower or need a bit more time. Some others might be enhanced. But they can learn and develop, and working with this, rehabilitation is a key aspect of enablement and support. And what it all means is that practice will change with circumstances and capacity at any point in time, responsive to a person's changing needs and to what is their own best life that's possible at the time. So I think the challenge for all of us without dementia, I think people with dementia are pretty good at defining their own challenges in my experience, but I think the challenge for the rest of us is to are we going to choose to be part of a virtuous circle that starts to reshape what is possible in dementia land? Because there is that sort of the power of a virtuous circle. But you know what? It involves giving up being the expert, the one who knows, the one who has the power. And have I got time to end on a couple of quotes? Or would we rather go for questions? Okay. One of you here in the room might recognise this quote. I think it's a beaut one. We need to look beyond the deficit model of what we can't do and instead look at the skills and knowledge that we already have. Each one of us already had expertise, interests and passions prior to our diagnosis, which, if acknowledged and carefully nurtured and encouraged, can enable us to remain independent, retain agency and interested in engaging in our future lives, albeit with some adaptations and support where necessary. There is an emerging realisation that when diagnosed with dementia and supported at the earliest opportunity, there will be a longer period of successful engagement with the person's current and future life. And this can maintain hope for possibilities into the future and feelings of being valued as a person who can still contribute, who does still contribute to their family and society. And there's then a list of, but that would be another half hour, of really particular things that I think we're confronted with needing to think through and design for if we take this on. And in fact, there's some of us engaged in looking at putting together a 5-year piece of work to develop and build that, and look at pathways for change and what are some of the practical things and where can I start and what are the core principles that can't be abandoned in terms of going this way. We're in the processing of putting that together and looking for funding and telling people that we want to collaborate with them and waiting to have our first meeting to get us all together to do that. And there is good work underway in some other parts of the world, especially UK and Scotland on some of this. And so, as I said, you know, you can't get up in the morning if you're not optimistic. And for me, if we can accomplish this, then in 20 years' time, what the world will be like for a person with dementia, and hopefully there will be less of them, but there will still be some, is very, very different. Yeah, still, who wants a diagnosis of anything, really, but it'll be absent all the stigma and fear and all those all those things that currently come with it. So that's what we're working on.
I'm pretty sure there'll be time to ask Sue lots of questions during morning tea time. So for the interest of time, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Eamon Eales. So he's a geriatrician physician at the Prince Charles Hospital, and his research is really aiming to help people with dementia to live as well as possible. The interface of clinical and basic science.
Wow, where do I go after that? Am I the sacrificial lamb to the slaughter of clinicians? I don't know, but I'm in the coal face. But I have got to say, actually, what a great morning it's been in terms of you know, the speakers, in terms of how thoughtful it's been, the research that's been there, and the passion involved. And I think also with the, you know, with the group that's here, there's, you know, researchers, clinicians, the public, consumers. It's a fantastic melting pot, and this is the kind of group that's going to change things. And I do feel that rather than giving a sort of an overview and a talk, I'm part of a movement of change. Actually, it's quite exciting. So I'll just give you a little bit about myself first, and then talk about the network. So I'm a clinician at the north side at Prince Charles. Excuse me. A physician and geriatrician. I have an interest in a clinical and research interest in cognitive disorders, including delirium and dementia. The two are inextricably bound, really, within the acute sector. In terms of kind of research interests, I have, in the delirium space, we've developed screening tools, including electronic screening tools, decision support tools, looking at new models of care and other innovations within the delirium space, such as reconceptualization, looking at functional MRI. And we got an app for it, so that's pretty exciting. And in the dementia space, we've got some great collaborations with the QBI also. So we've got this project called Sterling's Dream Project, which is really looking at a new look at trying to establish the chemical footprint and the signature associated with Alzheimer's disease. And also both these projects with Lizzie Coulson, also looking at obstructive sleep apnea and dementia. So it's a very exciting area at present. I'm kind of busy clinically. I mean, I just on the weekend, I had 30 patients, and just to put it in perspective, I probably had about a third of those patients were affected by dementia or delirium, so it's very common within our workplace too. So that's a bit of a background to me, but less about me and more about the statewide dementia network. It's been around since 2007, and really, I think the impetus behind it was that Queensland Health is a disparate organisation geographically, with lots of different hospitals and healthcare sectors, and there was lots of good things going on, but not everyone necessarily knew what the good things were going on and where they were happening. So in an effort to bring those clinicians together and to try and really reveal those good things that were going on, and to spread that good practice and develop those good practices, and to also harmonise practice, that set the seeds for the statewide dementia network. I sit on the steering committee, and So we meet up on a monthly basis just to establish strategic and operational priorities, along with Marianne also and Megan here, and John. Sorry, of course, John. And I was going to say, Marianne, how long? Do you mind me asking how long have you? Because you were there.
Probably about my fifth year.
Fifth year. Yeah.
I've been renewed a couple of times.
Excellent. New blood, of course. And so we meet up, and the reason behind that is I think some of it was we have a forum. We have a forum which happens every 6 months, and in that forum is a chance for everyone in Queensland to get together, both clinicians, consumers, and researchers all get together in sort of melting pot of information gathering and platform sharing. The statewide dementia network is co-chaired by Karen Harvey, who's a clinician also at the North Side, and Denise Craig, who's a psychologist from Cairns. So really, we get together to try and promote ideas around innovation, foster education and research, and disseminate knowledge, mainly through the forum. And it's an open forum for information sharing and to establish ties with other dementia care organisations, state and national bodies. So there's a few projects going on. The other thing that we do is we have working groups, and these working groups are working on priorities. So these priorities are things like young onset dementia, so we've developed information around that, around working with telehealth and dementia, and currently there's the enablement program and also the discharge from hospital project, which all are things that have been achieved already or in progress right now, and it's really just to enhance the clinical care in dementia, really around the acute sector and egress from acute sector. The other thing we do is obviously collaborate with other statewide clinical networks. I think we were the first network to develop the statewide framework, which has now become a national framework, and also fostering relationships with research organisations such as CJ Cadra. There's also a cognitive impairment screening toolkit, which is going to be very handy. So as mentioned, there's a lot of members. There's nearly 400 members, and always increasing membership, particularly with representation across different domains. We are, as I say, a multidisciplinary. The clinicians amongst us are very multidisciplinary. So there's psychology, there's occupational therapy, there's speech and language therapy, physicians, geriatricians. Forgive me if I'm missing anyone. Nursing, of course. And we have it's a biannual forum, and that usually takes place over in the education wing of the Royal Brisbane Hospital. And it's a very friendly and collaborative environment. So I have it on good authority that new members are welcome. So I've got an email there if anyone would kindly express any interest and any questions.
On diagnostic tools, and just with treatment of dementia, is the diagnosis of the specific kind of dementia very informative for the treatment? I mean, in my experience, it was a fairly general treatment once diagnosis was made, but obviously
So if I can relay the question. So the question is around the diagnosis in terms of how are the tools generic in terms of working out whether someone has dementia or not, or the subtypes of dementia, as Jürgen, I think, was talking about this morning, with Alzheimer's disease most common, but obviously there have been other tools. And usually, I guess in a clinical setting, our approach is normally to establish whether someone, whether an individual has a dementia or not. And then once we've established that, it's usually to try and identify which subtype of dementia, whether it's an Alzheimer's disease type, whether it's a vascular dementia or mixed, with the other dementias being perhaps more rare after that. And that's usually the process that I think most individuals apply within the clinical domain. Now, that clearly does inform how one approaches management. So, for instance, there'd only be reimbursement for treatment for dementia of Alzheimer's type. So the conventional medications used, such as cholinesterase inhibitors, we'd then only have approval to give those if it's Alzheimer's dementia. So it does have implications for treatment. There are other types of dementia where there would be very contrary views about what treatments we can and can't give. So, for instance, sometimes in Alzheimer's disease, if there is severe psychosis and psychological symptoms associated with dementia, one may consider neuroleptic agents. However, that's going to be contraindicated in other subtypes of dementia, such as Lewy body disease, where it can cause a lot of problems. So one really does need a nuanced approach. It's not just about whether a patient has dementia or not, it's also about subtype. And also, I think one of the other things we're doing is, one of the big interests at the moment in terms, I think, and I think was alluded to this morning in terms of the research space is in the early or the prodromal types of Alzheimer's disease, where it's thought that disease-modifying therapies might have a greater effect. And we're also doing some clinical trials. I'm a PI on one of the trials as well at our hospital. And that's really looking at the early dementia phase, because it's thought that if you are going to try and modify the disease progression, that's the time to hit it. So that's going to be very much part of our armamentarium.
And is imaging the key?
So is imaging the key? So imaging is an important resource. It's the diagnosis is not an imaging-based diagnosis alone. So either CT scans or MRIs will help to define the diagnosis somewhat, but it won't. Looking at a CT scan or an MRI scan won't tell us absolutely what the problem is, because it's a clinical diagnosis. I would obviously be very much in favour of diagnostic tools. We have a monthly neuroradiology meeting where we discuss all our patients with our neuroradiologist, and also as part of our two research studies with the QBI and Lizzie Coulson, we're looking both at amyloid imaging, which tells us what the amyloid burden is in the brain, and we're also looking at, as I say, what's called this FEOBV signal, which is trying to harness the chemical footprint, the thinking and memory chemical footprint in the brain, which we think is a very exciting step forward. Thank you. Megan, you can't ask. You're in the house.
I just want to spruik the benefit of joining the statewide dementia clinical network. I'm an acute senior occupational therapist at Robina Hospital. A very, front line, making change, bringing all this great stuff we've heard today into actual clinical practice. So we need more people, I think, like myself, on these committees, on these to actually translate all this knowledge we're hearing into practice. So let me encourage you to consider joining and contributing in that way.
All right, if there's no more questions, please join me in thanks Eden.